In 2800 BC, someone in Mesopotamia wrote down a recipe. It was for soap. A Sumerian scribe whose name is lost to time pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay on the banks of the Tigris. He recorded 1 part water, 3 parts alkali, 1 part cassia oil. The tablet came from the ruins of Tello, ancient Girsu in modern-day Iraq. Its purpose was not bathing, it was for washing wool. But the chemical principle that would one day clean every human body on Earth was already there. The scribe almost certainly did not invent the recipe himself. He was copying down a formula that had been passed through generations of textile workers, who discovered that fire ashes mixed with oil produced a substance that stripped grease from raw fleece. Archaeologists found the tablet among temple records. The Sumerians categorized it alongside inventories of grain and livestock. An industrial formula, not a cosmetic one. And for over 1,000 years, that remained the pattern. Cleansing agents existed. They just were not for people. Then, around 1550 BC, more than 1,000 years later, Egyptian physicians took the idea further. The Ebers Papyrus, a 68-foot medical scroll purchased by German Egyptologist Georg Ebers at Thebes in 1873, contained something new. It described a paste made from animal fats, vegetable oils, and natron. Natron was the key. It was a naturally occurring sodium carbonate harvested from dry lake beds in Wadi el Natron, northwest of the Nile Delta. Egyptian embalmers already used it to dehydrate corpses during mummification. The physicians who wrote the Ebers Papyrus realized that if you mixed natron with oils, the gritty paste could scrub dead skin and treat rashes, boils, and scabies. This was no longer just industrial chemistry. It was personal medicine. The paste was deliberately formulated for human skin. But even the Egyptians did not use it as a daily wash. They reserved it for the sick, the afflicted, the people whose skin had already broken down. For everyday cleanliness, they reached for something more direct, natron by itself, mixed with plain water and river sand. The combination produced a caustic, abrasive slurry that scoured sweat, dirt, and dead skin off the body. It was brutal, effective, and deeply uncomfortable. The sand acted as a mechanical abrasive, while the alkaline natron dissolved oils and grease. No one would describe it as pleasant. It was the ancient equivalent of scrubbing yourself with baking soda mixed with gravel. But it worked, and it was available. Every Egyptian who lived near the Nile had access to sand and water. Natron was cheap, mined from the dry lake beds by teams of laborers and transported downriver. The result was a population that was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively clean, at least compared to what Europe would become centuries later. But here is the part that matters most for everything that follows. None of these early methods were true soap. True soap required saponification, the chemical reaction that occurs when fats or oils are boiled with a strong alkali. That reaction splits the fat molecules into fatty acid salts and glycerol. The salts are what we call soap. The ancient Sumerians and Egyptians never achieved this. Their pastes, their natron scrubs, their oil and ash mixtures, all of them cleaned through mechanical abrasion or simple alkalinity. They were proto-soaps, useful, ingenious, and entirely functional. But the molecular transformation that produces actual soap, the kind that dissolves in water and lifts oil off skin without leaving a gritty residue behind, had not yet been discovered. That discovery still lay centuries in the future. But true soap was not what was coming next. 1,000 miles northwest of the Nile, the Greeks had already solved the problem of human filth in a completely different way. They did not make soap at all. What they made was a ritual. By the 5th century BC, a Greek athlete leaving the gymnasium after hours of wrestling, running, and discus throwing was coated in a thick paste of sweat, olive oil, and fine dust. He did not reach for a basin of water. He did not look for anything resembling soap. He reached for his strigil. The strigil was a curved metal scraper, typically cast in bronze or iron, shaped like a long, shallow sickle with a handle at one end. A typical strigil measured about 8 to 12 inches from handle to tip. The curved blade was blunt, not sharp, designed to scrape rather than cut. And the method was simple. A Greek bather first stripped completely naked. He then poured scented olive oil across his entire body and rubbed it into his skin with his hands. The oil served a precise function. It dissolved the oily component of sweat and lifted dirt, dust, and dead skin cells off the surface of the epidermis. Once the oil had loosened everything, the bather took the strigil and scraped. He drew the curved blade firmly down his arms, his legs, his torso, his back, sometimes with the help of a slave or attendant for the places he could not reach. The blade peeled off a gray, greasy film of oil, sweat, and dirt in long, thin ribbons. What remained on the skin was a microscopic layer of clean olive oil, which served as a protective barrier. The scraped-off residue fell to the floor in curled shavings. Greek gymnasium floors covered in these oily scrapings were considered so valuable that some facilities collected and resold the residue for medicinal ointments. The entire process required no water at all. It was fast, effective, and for centuries, it was absolutely universal across the Greek-speaking world. No free Greek citizen considered himself clean without it. Hippocrates, the physician born on the island of Kos around 460 BC, did not just observe this practice, he endorsed it. In his medical writings, Hippocrates classified bathing and friction as therapeutic interventions. He noted that the mechanical scraping of the strigil stimulated blood flow to the skin's surface, opened the pores, and removed the accumulated humoral waste that his medical theory held responsible for disease. The friction mattered as much as the cleaning. A sluggish, sedentary body accumulated corrupt humors. A body vigorously scraped with a strigil was a body whose internal balance had been restored. Galen, writing from Rome 5 centuries later, but steeped in the Greek medical tradition, expanded on the same principle. He recommended the strigil for patients suffering from a wide range of ailments, from fevers to joint pain to digestive complaints. The instrument was not a cosmetic luxury in Galen's framework. It was a medical device. The physical evidence for how deeply the strigil penetrated Greek daily life is staggering. Thousands of surviving red figure and black figure Athenian vases, painted between roughly 530 and 330 BC, depict the strigil in meticulous detail. You can see it hanging from athletes' wrists by a leather thong. You can see young men scraping each other's backs in the palestra. You can see it laid alongside oil flasks and sponges at the edge of a bathing scene. The British Museum alone holds over 50 surviving strigils excavated from Greek and Roman sites. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York holds dozens more. They vary in material, some bronze, some iron, a few in silver belonging to the very wealthy. But the shape is remarkably consistent across centuries and regions. The strigil was not a fashion, it was infrastructure. Aristophanes, the Athenian comic playwright, referenced the strigil multiple times in his surviving works. In the Knights, produced in 424 BC, a character is described as scraping himself down after exercise. In the Clouds, first performed in 423 BC, the strigil and oil flask appear together as the essential equipment of any self-respecting young Athenian man. These were not elite objects. A bronze strigil was affordable to any citizen who could afford basic athletic training, which meant nearly all of them. Even the poorest freeborn Greek man owned a strigil or shared one with his family. The oil he used for cleaning was the same olive oil he already cooked with and burned in lamps. No additional purchase was required. But the strigil alone could not reach every part of the body. The soles of the feet, the elbows, the knees, areas of thickened, calloused skin required something more abrasive. So the Greeks added a second stage. Before the oil or sometimes after the scraping, they rubbed their skin with fine sand, pumice powder, or wood ash. The pumice, imported from volcanic islands like Thera and Melos, was ground into a fine grit and used exactly like a modern exfoliating scrub. It scoured away the toughest dead skin with a mechanical efficiency that the blunt strigil blade could not match. Ash from hearth fires, rich in potassium carbonate, added a mild alkaline component that helped break down residual grease. Between the oil, the strigil, and the abrasives, the Greek body was as clean as any body in the ancient world. Cleaner, in fact, than many European bodies would be 2,000 years later. And the system had a further advantage no one at the time could have articulated. Because it used no soap, it required no saponification. Because it required no heated water, it consumed no fuel. A Greek soldier on campaign, a farmer in the Attic countryside, a sailor aboard a merchant galley, all of them could achieve a full-body cleaning with a small flask of oil, a bronze scraper, and a handful of sand. The method was portable, cheap, and independent of infrastructure. That independence would not survive the next empire. The Romans did not invent the bath. They inherited the strigil, the oil, and the entire Greek cleaning method, and then they built an empire around it. What the Greeks did in a portable basin or a riverbank, the Romans industrialized. By the 1st century BC, the city of Rome had begun constructing bathing complexes on a scale the Mediterranean world had never seen. The sequence was rigid, and every Roman citizen knew it by heart. A bather entered first into the tepidarium, a warm room, heated by a hypocaust system that circulated hot air beneath a raised floor and through hollow channels in the walls. The temperature here was moderate, around 30 degrees Celsius, enough to open the pores gradually without shocking the body. The bather sat on a marble bench and the heat began its work. From the tepidarium he moved into the caldarium, the hot room, where the temperature climbed past 40 degrees and heavy steam filled the air from a shallow pool of heated water. Sweat poured from the skin in sheets. At this moment, the bather did not reach for soap. He reached for oil, exactly as the Greeks had done, pouring it across his arms, his chest, his thighs, working it into the skin with his hands. Then the strigil came out. An attendant, called a capsarius in the Roman context, scraped the oil, sweat, and accumulated filth from the bather's body in long, methodical strokes. The curved bronze blade pulled away everything the skin had released in the heat. After the scraping came the pumice stone, rubbed hard against the elbows, the knees, the soles of the feet to grind away calluses. Only when the body was fully scraped and scoured did the bather plunge into the caldarium's hot pool, then rinse in the tepidarium, and finally brace himself for the shock of the frigidarium. The frigidarium held a cold plunge pool, often open to the sky, where the bather submerged himself to close the pores and tighten the skin. The entire process was a sequence of controlled thermal shocks and mechanical cleaning, and it used no soap whatsoever. The Roman bathing system spread wherever Roman roads went. By the end of the 1st century AD, bathhouses stood in every Roman settlement from Britain to North Africa, from Syria to Spain. They were not luxuries reserved for the wealthy. The entry fee to a public bath was typically a single quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, affordable to nearly any free man in the city. Children often entered free. Some emperors subsidized baths entirely, opening them to the public at no cost as a gesture of civic generosity. The bathhouse was a social leveler, a place where senators and shopkeepers sweated side by side on the same marble benches. But the Romans did know about soap. They simply did not use it for washing. In the year 77 AD, a Roman author and naturalist named Pliny the Elder completed his monumental encyclopedia, Naturalis Historia, in 37 books. In Book 28, Chapter 51, Pliny wrote about a substance the Gauls called sapo. His description was precise. Soap, Pliny recorded, was an invention of the Gallic tribes, made from tallow, rendered beef or mutton fat, combined with wood ash and boiled into a thick, greasy paste. The Gauls used it to stiffen and dye their hair a reddish tint. Pliny described it as a cosmetic, not a cleanser. He noted that the Germanic tribes across the Rhine also manufactured the substance and used it for a broader purpose, applying it to the skin for washing. But the Romans themselves saw no reason to adopt it. The strigil and pumice system was clean, proven, and backed by centuries of medical authority. Soap remained a provincial curiosity, a barbarian hair product that had no place in a proper Roman bath. This is the detail that makes the whole history of hygiene so strange. The Romans had soap, they simply rejected it. They had constructed the most advanced bathing infrastructure in the ancient world. Aqueducts that delivered millions of gallons of fresh water daily, furnaces that heated entire buildings, drainage systems that carried waste to the Tiber, and yet the actual cleaning method they used had not fundamentally changed since the days of Periclean Athens. Oil, scrape, rinse, repeat. Soap waited on the periphery of the empire for centuries, while millions of Romans scraped themselves clean with blunt bronze blades. And the scale of the infrastructure that supported this rejection was staggering. By the 4th century AD, the city of Rome alone contained 11 public thermae, the massive imperial bathing complexes, and more than 900 smaller private bathhouses called balneae. The Baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 AD, covered 25 hectares and could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. The Baths of Diocletian, dedicated in 306 AD, were even larger. They covered 13 hectares and could hold 3,000 bathers simultaneously in their halls. The complex included libraries, lecture halls, gardens, and exercise courts, alongside the heated rooms and plunge pools. To supply these baths, the aqueducts of Rome carried an estimated 1 million cubic meters of water into the city every single day. The Aqua Marcia, the Aqua Claudia, the Aqua Virgo, each one a stone channel stretching for miles across the Campania, fed the constant hunger of the baths for fresh water. Furnace slaves shoveled wood into hypocaust fires around the clock. The baths never closed. And in every one of them, in every corner of the empire, the ritual was the same. Oil applied, strigil scraped, pumice rubbed. Soap remained an afterthought, a footnote in a natural history, a tribal curiosity that Pliny had catalogued and dismissed. It would take the collapse of the empire itself, the slow disintegration of the aqueducts, the shuttering of the great baths, and the rise of a new civilization before soap finally crossed the line from hair pomade to hygiene. The empire that had rejected soap did not fall all at once. It eroded piece by piece over 2 centuries. The aqueducts cracked and went unrepaired. The great baths of Caracalla and Diocletian sat empty, their hypocaust furnaces cold, their plunge pools dry. And in the eastern provinces, far from the crumbling marble of Rome, a different civilization was quietly perfecting the thing Pliny had dismissed as a barbarian hair pomade. The city of Aleppo sat at the crossroads of the Silk Road and the spice routes, a trading hub in northern Syria where merchants from Persia, India, China, and the Mediterranean exchanged goods, ideas, and technologies. By the 8th century AD, the craftsmen of Aleppo had begun producing a hard soap unlike anything the Gauls or Germans had ever boiled in their pots. The recipe was precise. Pure olive oil, pressed from the groves that covered the hills of the Levant, was combined with lye extracted from the ashes of barilla plants and sea saltwort. To this mixture, the soap makers added a second oil, distilled from the berries of the laurel tree, Laurus nobilis, which grew wild across the coastal mountains. Laurel oil was the innovation that separated Aleppo soap from every cleansing substance that had come before it. It was antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, and it gave the finished bars a sharp, medicinal green scent that lingered on the skin for hours after bathing. The soap makers boiled the oils and lye together in great copper cauldrons over wood fires for 3 days, stirring constantly with long wooden paddles. When the mixture thickened to a heavy paste, they poured it onto stone floors, spread it flat, and let it cool until it could be cut. Workers used wooden frames and long-handled knives to slice the mass into rough cubic blocks. Each block was stamped with the maker's mark by hand. Then the soap was stacked in towering conical pyramids inside airy drying halls and left to cure for a minimum of 9 months. Over those months, the bars oxidized. Their outer surfaces turned from green to a deep, leathery gold, while the interior remained a pale, waxy emerald. The process was slow, expensive, and unforgiving. A single batch ruined by bad lye or poor oil meant months of labor and an entire season's profit vanishing into the curing hall. But the product that emerged was a true personal cleansing bar designed for human skin, not for wool, not for hair. It lathered in hard water, it rinsed clean without leaving a greasy film, and it held its shape without dissolving into slime. Word of Aleppo soap traveled along the trade routes faster than the caravans could carry it. In the city of Ray, south of modern Tehran, a physician named Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi encountered the substance in his medical practice. Al-Razi was born in 865 AD, and by the time of his death in 925, he had authored over 200 books on medicine, chemistry, philosophy, and alchemy. He served as chief physician at the Great Hospital of Baghdad, and his reputation drew students from across the Islamic world. In his medical encyclopedias, particularly the Kitab al-Hawi, the comprehensive book on medicine, al-Razi documented soap making in clinical detail. He specified the exact proportions of alkali and oil required to produce a soap that would treat scabies, ringworm, and infected wounds without damaging the surrounding skin. He described how to adjust the strength of the lye depending on the patient's condition. Milder for children and the elderly, stronger for laborers with thick, calloused hands. His recipes were not theories. They were tested protocols, written for physicians who would compound the soap themselves in their own dispensaries. Al-Razi's work was translated into Latin in the 12th century, and his soap formulations entered the medical curriculum of European universities. But Aleppo was not the only city in the Levant producing hard soap by the 10th century. To the south, in the hills of Palestine, the city of Nablus developed its own tradition. The soap makers of Nablus used virgin olive oil from the terraced groves that had covered the surrounding slopes since Canaanite times. They mixed it not with laurel but with natron, the same naturally occurring sodium carbonate the Egyptians had used 3,000 years earlier, mined from deposits east of the Jordan River. The oil and natron were boiled together in stone vats, then poured onto clean floors to set. The resulting bars were pure white, not green and gold like Aleppo soap. They had no medicinal scent, no laurel sting. They were mild, unscented, and so gentle they could be used on an infant's skin without irritation. Nabulsi soap makers wrapped each dried bar in paper and stamped it with the family seal. The soap was then aged in underground cellars for up to a year, stacked in columns that reached from floor to ceiling. When a batch was ready, it was loaded onto camels and donkeys and carried to the ports of Acre and Jaffa. From there, Venetian and Genoese merchants loaded it into the holds of their galleys, alongside bolts of Damascene silk, sacks of pepper, and jars of olive oil. The soap of Aleppo and Nablus traveled west across the Mediterranean and north through the Balkans. It reached the markets of Constantinople and the bathhouses of Córdoba. It appeared in the inventories of crusader lords who had encountered it in the Levant and demanded it for their own use when they returned to France and England. By the 13th century, hard soap was a standard export commodity of the Eastern Mediterranean. European apothecaries stocked it. European physicians prescribed it. The knowledge that had begun with a Sumerian clay tablet, that had passed through Egyptian papyrus and Greek medicine and Roman engineering, had finally crossed a threshold. True soap for personal bathing existed. It worked. And it was no longer a tribal curiosity or a barbarian hair pomade. It was a medical tool, a trade good, and a marker of civilization. But the Europeans who bought Levantine soap in the 13th century could not yet manufacture it themselves at scale. The olive groves of Spain and Italy could supply oil, but the knowledge of precise alkali extraction, the curing techniques, the patience required to age soap properly for 9 months or more, remained concentrated in the workshops of Aleppo and Nablus. And within 200 years, the continent that was now importing soap would nearly forget how to wash it all. In the year 1268, during the reign of King Louis IX, the city of Paris compiled a book of trade regulations known as the Établissement des Métiers de Paris. That document, a dry legal code meant to govern the conduct of artisans, recorded something that now seems almost unbelievable. Paris, a medieval walled city of narrow streets and timbered houses, contained 32 public bathhouses. They were called estuves, from the Latin word for steam, and they were not hidden in back alleys or restricted to the wealthy. The bathhouses operated openly on major streets, their entrances marked by painted signs and lanterns, their doors open to men and women of every class. A customer paid a few deniers at the door and was led into a chamber thick with steam and the scent of herbs. The water was heated in massive copper cauldrons suspended over wood fires, then piped into wooden tubs lined with linen sheets to prevent splinters. Attendants poured hot water infused with lavender, rosemary, marjoram, and chamomile into each tub. The steam carried the sharp green fragrance of crushed herbs through every room. Bathers soaked communally, sometimes 6 or 8 to a single large tub, the heat drawing sweat and loosening the grime of daily life. The experience was not silent or solitary. Medieval bathhouses were social spaces where neighbors gossiped, merchants negotiated deals, and musicians sometimes played in the corners. Food and wine were served, couples courted. The bathhouse was as much a fixture of Parisian life as the bakery or the tavern. And the men who ran these establishments were not mere innkeepers. The Guild of Barber Surgeons held legal authority over the bathhouses of Paris, a monopoly granted by royal charter and fiercely defended. A barber surgeon in the 13th century was a hybrid profession that no modern equivalent captures. He cut hair, trimmed beards, lanced abscesses, pulled teeth, set broken bones, performed bloodletting, and supervised bathing. The red and white striped pole that still spins outside barbershops today descends from this era, the colors originally representing blood and bandages. In the bathhouses under his supervision, a customer could receive a shave, a haircut, a tooth extraction, and a hot bath in a single visit. Bloodletting was performed in a side room, the barber surgeon opening a vein with a fleam and catching the blood in a shallow basin. The patient then soaked in the hot tub to restore warmth and balance to the humors. Soap was present in these bathhouses, but it was expensive, imported from the Levant at considerable cost or manufactured locally in small, inconsistent batches. A bar of Aleppo soap represented months of skilled labor and a long curing process that European artisans had not yet mastered. The price of a single bar could equal a laborer's daily wage. So the bathers who could not afford imported soap used what was available. Alkaline wood ash lye, filtered through straw and mixed with hot water, served as a harsh but effective degreaser that stripped oil and dirt from skin and hair. Fuller's earth, a fine absorbent clay used by the cloth finishing trade to remove grease from wool, doubled as a body scrub. Women mixed the clay with water into a thin paste, rubbed it across their skin, and rinsed it away in the tub. It left no fragrance, but it pulled oil and sweat from the pores by absorption rather than chemical reaction. The bathers who used these substitutes were not ignorant of soap. They simply could not obtain it in quantity. The soap makers of Paris were few, and their output was modest, limited by the cost of imported olive oil and the difficulty of producing consistent lye from local wood ash. Most of what they made was soft soap, a gelatinous, potassium-based substance that dissolved quickly in hot water and had to be stored in sealed jars. It was adequate for laundry and for scrubbing floors, but it lacked the hard, long-lasting quality of the cured bars from Aleppo and Nablus. Hard soap for personal bathing remained a luxury good, sold by apothecaries alongside imported spices and medicinal compounds. The bathhouses of Paris were not unique. Similar establishments existed in London, Cologne, Vienna, and nearly every European city of sufficient size. In Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames, Londoners bathed at the Stews, a row of bathhouses that also functioned as brothels and were regulated by the Bishop of Winchester. In Germany, the bathhouse culture was so deeply embedded that guilds of bathkeepers, the Bader, held significant political power in many towns. By the early 14th century, public bathing was a fixture of urban life across the continent, a daily or weekly ritual for anyone who could afford the modest entry fee. The habit of communal bathing had survived the collapse of the Roman Empire in the East, transmitted through the bathhouses of Constantinople and the hammams of the Islamic world, then carried back west by crusaders and merchants. It was not as grand as the Roman thermae, no marble floors or towering aqueducts, but it was functional and widespread and deeply woven into the social fabric. And then, in the autumn of 1347, ships from the Black Sea docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The crews were dying of a disease no European physician had ever seen. By the spring of 1348, the Black Death had reached Paris. Within 2 years, it would kill between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. The public bathhouse, the warm, wet, crowded room where strangers soaked together in shared water, had reached its high point. It would not survive what came next. In the summer of 1348, the physicians of the University of Paris delivered their official verdict on the cause of the plague. The Faculty of Medicine, the most prestigious in Europe, issued a formal report to King Philip VI. Warm baths, they concluded, opened the pores of the skin and allowed pestilential air to enter the body. The solution was not to bathe more, but to stop bathing entirely. The city of Paris acted on this advice with brutal speed. That same year, the provost of Paris ordered the closure of all 32 public bathhouses within the city walls. The copper cauldrons went cold. The wooden tubs were upturned and stored away. The barber surgeons who had managed the estuves for generations were told their services were no longer welcome. This was not a temporary measure imposed for a single season of plague. The closure became permanent doctrine, reinforced by decree after decree through the decades that followed. In 1368, the ban was renewed. In 1409, it was renewed again. In 1426, the Parliament of Paris formally prohibited public bathing on the grounds that it weakened the body and invited disease. By the 1450s, the estuves of Paris were gone, their buildings converted into private homes, warehouses, or simply left to rot. And Paris was not alone. Medical faculties in Montpellier, Bologna, Oxford, and Vienna issued nearly identical warnings. Warm water was dangerous. Open pores were a liability. The skin, according to Galenic theory, inherited and now rigidly misinterpreted, was a porous membrane that had to remain sealed against corrupted air. The result was that full-body immersion in water became something people feared rather than sought. A living tradition that had stretched from the Roman thermae through the Islamic hammams and into the bathhouses of medieval Europe was severed within 2 generations. What replaced it was not a better form of washing, but a complete redefinition of what it meant to be clean. The new method was called dry washing, and it required no water at all. The theory rested on a simple premise. The human body continuously expelled waste through the skin in the form of invisible excreta, sweat, oils, and vapors. If water could not be trusted to remove this waste without opening the pores to plague, then something else had to absorb it. The answer was linen. Clean white linen, rubbed vigorously against the skin, was believed to draw the excreta out of the pores and into the fabric. Changing one's undergarments daily was considered the equivalent of a full bath. This idea was not fringe folklore confined to peasant superstition. It was the official position of the most influential medical text of the era, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a treatise originally composed at the medical school of Salerno in the 12th century and reprinted continuously through the 15th and 16th centuries, explicitly endorsed the practice. Its verses, translated into every major European language, instructed readers that clean linen preserved health and that washing with water was unnecessary and dangerous. The aristocracy embraced dry washing with a fervor that bordered on obsession. A wealthy man or woman in the 16th or 17th century might own dozens of linen undershirts, chemises, and nightcaps. The garments were changed several times a day, not only for comfort, but as a visible marker of status. To be seen in the same shirt twice was to be seen as someone who lacked the means to maintain hygiene. The cloth itself became the proof of cleanliness. The whiter the linen, the purer the body beneath it. Nowhere was this philosophy more starkly embodied than in the daily routine of Louis XIV of France. The Sun King ruled from 1643 to 1715, the most powerful monarch in Europe, master of the Palace of Versailles with its 700 rooms and its 1,400 fountains. And in his entire 72-year life, Louis XIV took exactly 2 full baths. His physician, Antoine Vallot, documented both occasions in the Journal de la Santé du Roi, the official record of the king's health. One bath was taken in 1647 to treat a leg wound that had become infected. The other was ordered in 1680 to induce sweating during a prolonged fever. Both were medical procedures administered under strict supervision, not acts of personal grooming. The king did not bathe for pleasure. He did not bathe for refreshment. He bathed the way a modern patient receives a surgical intervention, only when a doctor demanded it. Yet no one at the court of Versailles would have described Louis XIV as dirty. His valets changed his linen shirt multiple times each day, each change considered a complete wash in itself. After the linen was rubbed across his skin, the valets took perfumed cloths steeped in rosewater, orange flower water, and aromatic spirits, and wiped down his face, hands, and torso. The king did not need water because he had linen and perfume. And perfume was not an accessory in this system. It was the structural load-bearing element that made the entire edifice of dry washing viable. Without the daily scrubbing of soap and water, the human body produces a distinct and powerful odor. The court of Versailles dealt with this reality not by washing but by masking. Heavy animal-based perfumes became the signature scent of the European elite. Musk, extracted from the gland of the musk deer, was among the most prized. Civet, a pungent secretion from the civet cat of Africa and the Middle East, was another. Ambergris, a waxy substance vomited by sperm whales and weathered for years in ocean salt, sold for more than its weight in gold. These were not light, floral scents in the modern sense. They were dense, animalic, almost suffocating in their intensity. A wealthy woman in the court of Louis XIV might wear a small bag of ambergris and musk suspended from a chain around her neck. A fashionable gentleman doused his wig with civet oil before appearing in public. Gloves, handkerchiefs, letters, even furniture were saturated with perfumes strong enough to travel across a ballroom. The function of these scents was not decoration. It was deliberate olfactory warfare waged against a body that had not touched water in years. The physical reality beneath the linen and the perfume was grim. Skin conditions proliferated in the absence of regular washing. Court physicians recorded a steady stream of rashes, eruptions, sores, and persistent itching among their aristocratic patients. Lice nested in the seams of expensive gowns and in the folds of elaborate wigs, spread by the very linens that were supposed to be cleaning the body. Scabies mites burrowed into the skin of nobles who wore silks worth more than a peasant earned in a lifetime. The medical reports from the Hôtel Dieu in Paris document skin ulcers treated with poultices of bread and milk, rather than with soap and water. The great unwashed of Europe were not the poor huddled in tenements. The great unwashed were the kings, the queens, the courtiers, and the bishops who had been told by the finest medical minds on the continent that water was death and that a clean shirt was enough. In 1712, the Parliament of Great Britain passed an act that turned a basic household necessity into a guarded commodity. The soap tax levied a duty of 1 penny per pound on every bar of soap manufactured within the kingdom. That single penny was not a trivial surcharge. It represented roughly 20 to 25% of the retail price of an ordinary household soap at the time. The law did not simply collect revenue at the point of sale and leave the rest to the market. Excise officers received the legal authority to enter any soap-making premises at any hour of the day or night. They inspected each copper cauldron, weighed each batch, and locked the boiling vessels with official seals when production was not actively underway. A soap maker caught boiling a batch without an excise officer present to weigh the finished bars faced a fine of 50 pounds. That sum exceeded the annual income of most tradesmen. The legislation was not an accident of greedy policymaking. Britain was financing a war against France, the War of the Spanish Succession, and the crown needed revenue. Soap was chosen because everyone bought it, demand was inelastic, and the manufacturing process was centralized enough to monitor. Within a decade, the tax had done what centuries of medical superstition had only partially accomplished. It removed soap from the daily lives of ordinary people. A working family in London or Bristol or Manchester did not budget an extra 20% for a luxury. They simply stopped buying it. Households across England, Scotland, and Wales reverted to the methods their medieval ancestors had used before the Levantine trade brought hard soap to European ports. The most common substitute was lye water, made at home from nothing more than wood ash and rainwater. A woman would take the cold ash from the household hearth, pack it into a wooden barrel with a hole drilled near the bottom, and pour water over the top. The water seeped through the ash, dissolving the potassium carbonate from the burnt wood, and emerged from the hole as a thin, caustic brownish liquid. This was homemade lye, alkaline enough to cut through grease, harsh enough to roughen the skin into rawness with repeated use. To scrub the body, families used fine sand collected from riverbanks and masons' yards. The sand acted as a mechanical abrasive, grinding off dirt and dead skin in the same motion the ancient Greeks had used with their perfumed oils. Those who could not get sand used bran. The consequences of a nation scrubbing itself with ash water and grain husks were not subtle. By the middle of the 18th century, the medical wards of Paris, London, and Vienna were filled with conditions that a bar of soap could have prevented. The records of the Hôtel Dieu, the oldest hospital in Paris, tell the story in clinical shorthand. Admission logs from the 1730s and 1740s document a steady influx of patients suffering from gale, the French term for scabies. Scabies is caused by a microscopic mite, Sarcoptes scabii, that burrows into the outer layer of human skin to lay its eggs. The infestation produces an intolerable itching that intensifies at night, driving patients to scratch until the skin breaks open. Those open wounds then admitted secondary bacterial infections that turned a parasitic nuisance into a life-threatening condition. Physicians at the Hôtel Dieu treated advanced cases. Lice were endemic at every level of society, but the burden fell heaviest on the urban poor. The body louse, Pediculus humanus corporis, lived not on the skin but in the seams of clothing, emerging to feed several times a day. In the crowded tenements of St. Giles in London, where entire families shared a single room, one infested garment seeded the next within hours. Typhus, the disease carried by the feces of the body louse, tore through these neighborhoods in waves. Outbreaks were recorded in London in 1714, 1741, and 1750, each one killing thousands before burning out. The connection between filth, lice, and disease would not be scientifically proven for another century and a half. In the 18th century, the medical establishment still operated on a framework that blamed miasmas, foul air rising from rotting matter, for most epidemics. A physician walking through the Hôtel Dieu in 1740 could look at a ward full of scabies patients, smelling the unwashed bodies beneath the linen sheets, and conclude that the problem was a corruption of the atmosphere, not a failure of personal cleansing. The term "the Great Unwashed" did not originate as a Victorian insult for the laboring classes. It was a literal description of a continent. The Roman citizens of the 2nd century, the Athenians of the 5th century BC, and the Syrians of the 10th century had all possessed reliable methods for keeping their skin clean. A Roman bricklayer scraped himself with oil and Strigil after a day of work. An Aleppo merchant washed with hard olive oil soap, cured for 9 months in the Syrian sun. A Japanese farmer bathed daily in a wooden tub heated by a charcoal fire. The European peasant of the 1740s, by contrast, rubbed his armpits with a handful of bran and slept in the same shirt for a week. The decline was not a technological loss. The knowledge to make hard soap had existed in the Levant for over 1,000 years and had been imported to Europe through the trade routes of Venice and Marseille. The decline was an economic and political one. A tax designed to fund a war had created a barrier between a basic chemical technology and the bodies that needed it. And that barrier would stand for another century, until a French chemist, driven not by concern for public health, but by a prize posted by the Academy of Sciences, found a way to manufacture alkali from ordinary salt. In 1791, a French chemist named Nicolas Leblanc filed a patent for a process that would do nothing less than change the surface of the human body. He was not trying to save the poor from scabies or restore the bathhouses of medieval Paris. He was chasing a prize posted by the French Academy of Sciences in 1775. A purse of 2,400 livres offered to anyone who could manufacture soda ash from common salt. The Academy had announced the prize because France possessed no natural deposits of the alkaline salts that soap makers, glassblowers, and textile dyers depended on. The country imported its alkali from Spanish barilla plants burned in coastal marshes, or from timber-rich regions of North America and Russia, where wood ash could be leached for potash. This reliance on foreign alkali was expensive, unpredictable, and vulnerable to naval blockades during wartime. Leblanc's solution was brutal in its chemical elegance. He took ordinary sea salt, dissolved it, and treated it with sulfuric acid. The reaction produced sodium sulfate, a crystalline salt that he then heated in a furnace with crushed limestone and pulverized coal. The furnace drove off carbon dioxide and left behind a gray-black solid mass called black ash, which, when dissolved in water and evaporated, yielded pure sodium carbonate. Soda ash. The missing ingredient that had kept soap a luxury for 4,000 years of human civilization. Leblanc himself would die by suicide in 1806, a broken man whose factory had been seized during the French Revolution, and whose patent was declared public property by the revolutionary government. He never profited from his discovery, but the process that bore his name spread across the industrializing world with a speed no previous chemical innovation had matched. By the 1820s, Leblanc plants were operating in Britain, Germany, and the United States. A single factory on the River Tyne in northern England could produce more soda ash in a week than 100 Spanish barilla fields could yield in a year. The price of alkali collapsed, and with it, collapsed the economic barrier that had stood between ordinary human beings and a bar of hard soap. In 1789, 2 years before Leblanc filed his patent, a Cornish barber named Andrew Pears had opened a shop on Gerrard Street in Soho, London. Pears noticed what every London barber in the late 18th century could observe firsthand. The upper classes arrived for their shaves with complexions ravaged by the harsh soaps available at the time, products that stripped the skin raw and left it flaking and inflamed. Pears began experimenting with a formula for a gentler soap. He dissolved high-quality tallow soap in alcohol to strip away the harsher impurities, then added glycerin, a byproduct that retained moisture instead of scouring it away. The result was a translucent amber bar with a honey-like clarity that had never been manufactured before. Pears' transparent soap was mild enough for use on the face and hands of the wealthy, and it became the product that taught a generation of British consumers that soap was not just for laundry. But the real acceleration came when Leblanc's cheap alkali met the Pears factory floor. Glycerin soap, once a boutique item for a few London addresses, could now be produced at a price that made it accessible to clerks, tradesmen, and eventually factory workers. By the 1840s, the Pears Company was mass-producing transparent soap blocks and shipping them across the empire. The ingredients were now cheap, the method was reproducible, and the market had been primed by a century of public health disasters. The man who completed the circuit was not a chemist or a barber, but a bureaucrat. Edwin Chadwick, secretary to the Poor Law Commission in Britain, spent the early 1840s compiling evidence that the filth of the industrial slums was not merely an aesthetic problem, but a lethal one. His 1842 report, the Report on the Sanitary Condition of the Laboring Population of Great Britain, laid out in relentless statistical detail that living in accumulated human waste, stagnant water, and unwashed conditions shortened the lives of the poor by decades. A farm laborer in Rutland could expect to live to 38. A factory hand in Manchester died on average at 17. Chadwick's central argument was that disease was not a visitation of providence, but a consequence of physical conditions that could be engineered away. The 1848 Public Health Act, the first legislation of its kind in modern Europe, established local boards of health with the authority to build sewers, drain streets, and regulate housing. Soap and water was no longer a matter of personal preference. It was becoming a civic requirement. The final obstacle fell in 1853. The British soap tax, the same levy enacted in 1712 to fund the War of the Spanish Succession, had for 141 years treated each bar of soap as a luxury good, subject to excise duties that doubled its retail price. The tax had survived 3 monarchs, 2 empires, and an industrial revolution. But it could not survive the combined force of cheap soda ash, mass-produced glycerin soap, and a public health movement armed with mortality statistics. William Gladstone, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, repealed the soap tax entirely in his 1853 budget. The effect was immediate and measured in human bodies. Within a decade, per capita soap consumption in Britain quadrupled. Bars of hard, clean, affordable soap appeared in the cupboards of working-class kitchens from Glasgow to Birmingham. The skin infections, the scabies wards, the typhus outbreaks that had filled the Hotel Dieu a century earlier began to recede. Not because medicine had advanced, but because people could finally afford to wash. A Roman bather of the 2nd century, scraping himself with oil in the baths of Caracalla, would have recognized a bar of Pears' soap as a curiosity, a Gaulish novelty for tinting hair. A citizen of Aleppo in the 10th century would have recognized the chemistry but found the scale unimaginable. The European peasant of 1854, lifting a bar of industrial soap from the basin for the first time, was holding something none of those earlier civilizations had ever possessed. An object that combined the alkali of the ancient Sumerian recipe, the hard form of the Levantine soap makers, and the mass production that only fossil-fueled industry could sustain. And all of it available for a few pence at the corner shop. The long arc from a Sumerian scribe pressing reed into wet clay to a factory in Lancashire, stamping glycerin bars by the million, had reached its conclusion.